Increasing numbers of people are waking up to the need to live more harmoniously with the earth, with one another, and with all life on the planet. We cannot continue as we have been, and other ways of living are possible. I am your host, Epiphany Paris, and I am one of the many holding space for this transformation. In this time, we can reconnect and share our gifts with one another. This show features conversations with rainbow warriors, healers, activists, artists, writers, farmers, and many other people who are living the questions and living the change in their personal lives. This show will focus on practical solutions, radical strategies, paradigm-shifting ideas, inspiring people, and spiritual transformations. This is the space between. In this space between the destructive times we have been living and the holistic way of life that is possible, we are here. What will we do with the time we have? Welcome to the show, everybody. You are listening to the archive of my interview with David Forbes. Unfortunately, the first few minutes of this interview are hard to understand because of an audio problem we experienced. I'm going to share a few excerpts of the section I cut out, and then we will go back to the original recording. David Forbes started out by saying that one reason he started The Breaking Time is because as a journalist, as someone who keeps track of events in the world and talks to as many people as he does, he's noticed that there were certain perspectives that weren't getting attention. Much of the world today is considered through business, marketing, or technological lenses, and he is interested in looking at the world through lenses of culture, history, politics, and a variety of perspectives to see how these factors tie together to get us to where we are today and where we might go from here. David says, I like to go into minute details, like asking how what's happening today affects a specific neighborhood. With an incident you run into on the street, does that portend something larger going on? What is it tied to? It's kind of easy to lose sight of what conditions are like for people on the ground, and that's a huge detriment when thinking about the future. Then we discussed his day job, working as a journalist for the Mountain Express. The types of topics he covers at the newspaper are hyper-local, whereas the topics for The Breaking Time allow him to take a bigger step back. We discussed objectivity. David says that objectivity is a great way for journalists to check their own assumptions. And when he writes for something like The Breaking Time, where David does offer more of his opinion, he still tries to take a step back and ask, what am I missing here? What's another perspective? He says, even if there's a cultural trend that I think is pretty loathsome, I'd like to ask, how did we get to this point? He goes on to say, when I mention our fractured era, kind of the reason I chose The Breaking Time is because I asked, what's the key theme for this era? The key theme is that things are breaking apart. It's not necessarily a bad thing, though. A lot of old limits, old taboos, old strictures on how people could or couldn't act are also breaking apart, and there's some real opportunity there. But at the same time, kind of everything, from economic systems to culture to government, the way people do their family and living, everything's being put to the test, and it's worth seeing how these will shake out. Old structures are breaking apart or having to undergo some fairly substantial changes. What is it going to look like on the other end? There's certainly a long tradition among journalists of advocates, people making no bones about where they are coming from. But at the same time, I think it's easy to just fall into these determined categories of, I'm a believer in this, whatever the cause may be, so I'm going to think this, and whatever happens, I will interpret it through this lens. I do think it's good to take a step back to just keep yourself sane as an individual and check, where's that assumption coming from? Why do I believe that? Does it still make sense? And go from there. We will now go back to the recording with David Forbes and myself. Thank you for listening. One thing I spend a lot of time thinking about with any kind of forms of media is neutrality, which seems different to me than objectivity.
It absolutely is. And that's kind of, neutrality, and again, objectivity is a tricky word too.
Yeah.
Some people define it different ways. But I mean, for example, if the facts say something, at least as near as we can determine. Nonetheless, I do think from the function, there's at least a need for some types of journalism that don't necessarily take a faction or a side. So when they say, hey, something looks wrong, like measurably, factually, lay it out, here's how it looks wrong, in a world with this many kind of competing factions, with this much polarization, I think it's important to have kind of some sort of arbiter there, to at least kind of interject something that is not always coming from a specific group or a specific faction.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And kind of where I was going with that is I'm sure you've heard the Desmond Tutu quote about neutrality.
Which one?
It's, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor.
Yeah. Yes, I have indeed heard that. I've heard it invoked for good reasons and not so good reasons. Frankly, I've covered protests for a long time, and back in college, I was involved in protests, and through those years, both in the Breaking Time and in other places, I've got some fairly blunt criticisms of the way protest culture operates. And I have seen that saying, which I think it has a lot of justice to it at its heart. I think Tutu certainly was onto something with it, being used to deploy the basically join up or else. If someone thinks that their cause is just, and someone is observing it, let's say fairly, and certainly there are plenty of cases where say protesters or activists are not treated fairly, but that if they assess fairly, including calling out flaws or revealing inner struggles or something like that, that I've heard that quote invoked, along with some various other ones, to be like, well, why aren't you falling in line with us on our side? And I think that's something to keep in mind as well.
It's interesting. I guess I hadn't really realized that it had been used in ways like that, as far as protesters saying, no, you can't criticize anything about the way we're doing what we're doing because we're the oppressed in this situation. But I see what you're saying. I know that it's something that I've been frustrated with mainstream media sources about, is that I feel like they do tend towards the bad sort of neutrality, where they try to make each party equal, and so you have a giant corporation, you have a community that's being affected by, say, toxins in their water or something, and they're trying to treat them as equal viewpoints without taking into factor the power differential.
I think that's definitely that's a perfect example right there. Well, another thing is it's require everyone to start proving their claims. If someone makes a claim, I've done a fair amount of reporting on labor issues over the years about reporting about, say, their work conditions. I'm going to ask them to give me as much proof as possible about that. But if for example, a bunch of employees can show proof that they're getting paid at a certain low rate or something like that. A story I write will treat that as the fact, and then ask the company to respond on that. Why do they think say a certain rate of pay or a certain condition is fair and merited, and kind of go forth from there, rather than being like a he said she said thing, which I think gets into some dangerous territory, and it's lazy, quite frankly.
Right. Well, among the circle that I traveled when I was living in Asheville, you were known as someone who was pretty heavily into researching and making sure, like going over the details of every tiny little thing related to a story you were covering. So I definitely didn't mean it as a criticism of you, but I was just curious of your interpretation of it.
No, and it's certainly a topic with many perspectives on it. And there are, I should say, journalists and writers who I greatly respect, who take a bit of a harsher tone towards objectivity than I do, or neutrality, period. So.
Okay. Well, and it's kind of interesting when you talk about it being used different ways. And your blog talks about cultural trends and that sort of thing. And it's interesting in how our time, especially like on the national scene, words get used so often to mean exactly the opposite of what they're intended to mean, their actual original definitions. And we see that in legislation all the time. New laws that are being proposed, that sound like they're meaning one thing, but they're actually kind of the opposite. So it's gotten to the point you have to actually really dig into things to understand at all what's being said, but most people don't, or a lot of people don't.
No, I would say most people don't. I don't think that's particularly a new phenomenon. What does refresh me is that I do think, and I have plenty of skepticism about kind of tech utopianism, but I do think there are some real positives out there. I think there are more ways for wonks and experts and researchers to take a look at something and go, wait a minute, and get that out in the view of the public eye than maybe there were in, say, my parents' time.
Right, that's true. That makes sense. So, we've been sort of talking about kind of perspective on just ways of looking at things. I think I'll kind of stick with that a little bit. On your blog, one of your taglines is, "There is no they." Could you talk about that?
Yes, that's been kind of the motto of the blog from its inception. I initially used that phrase in a piece I wrote for a wonderful magazine on alternative culture called Coil House, and I wrote a piece on the heavy metal subculture in the Middle East, which is one of the largest in the world and growing. It has been a major part of, and this before the Arab Spring, mind you, has been was a major kind of center of at least cultural dissent and kind of people trying, even putting bonds across national levels, Israelis and Lebanese and that sort of thing, who are all into this music and the subculture. And I mentioned that was kind of one of the inclusions, was that there is no they. And that kind of stuck with me, and I decided to make it the motto of the Breaking Time. And it's along what you said or mentioned earlier about there kind of being no easy answers, and that's definitely a theme of the blog, that there are multiple perspectives that need to be taken into account, is that there really isn't a they. That term is used all the time, whether it's, political factions talking about each other in very broad stereotypes, or people talking about a different ethnicity or a different religion. Kind of the idea that there is some monolithic they out there that can be easily judged and assessed, and that what actions they are going to take, usually in a negative connotation, then it's easier to make really stupid decisions about the world, quite bluntly. And this is, from a broader sense, this is also a practical way, I think, people trying to kind of make a better world, who kind of are not necessarily on the side of having a lot of power, or at least not at this point. I think the same type of thinking can infect them too, and not particularly in a good way. I've heard people often refer to politics as a they, or political parties as a they. Well, in reality, there isn't a the system. There is no they behind everything. It is a very fractured world and a fractured era, and there's always divisions. There's always groups within groups that think different ways about something. And I think keeping in mind that reality is it's kind of an antidote to falling into dogma, to falling into these easy answers that usually lead to reaction or really bad steps in times of chaos.
Do you think, on the other end of it, do you think that thinking about things can sometimes decrease people's ability to use discretion when looking at situations or people? Or is that just like a concern that I have that you don't feel is really...
Well, how so? What exactly? Can you kind of clarify a little bit?
I guess I don't have a direct analogy. Like, I don't have a direct way of explaining it, but I have an indirect way of explaining what I'm trying to say.
Certainly. Yeah.
I consider myself a spiritual person, and I don't necessarily expect you to feel that way or think that, I don't expect that we're going to be talking about spirituality much today or at all. But I know among spiritual people, there's a lot of different kinds of ideas and thoughts, and sometimes they get translated more widely than they were originally intended. Like, there's a lot of ideas about non-judgment and non-attachment and things like that. And sometimes I feel like that gets in people's way of then, like, using their discretion and accepting, like, a situation is not good, or a situation does involve injustice or things like that.
I would completely agree with you.
Yeah.
Continue, please.
Okay. Yeah. So when I see something like there is no they, I agree with it because I feel it, and I feel like I understand it at least to some degree. But at the same time, I wonder, like, how you keep that from, like, believing that, to how you keep from using that to not be able to use your discretion effectively But I guess that just comes back into the details again, like go into the details.
That's actually an excellent question you raise right there, because another thing that I kind of mentioned this in the statement we put out a few weeks ago when the Breaking Time came back from a long hiatus with a different design and kind of more of a focus of it'd been largely my personal project before then, and we're trying to get some more perspectives and some more guest contributors in there now. But there was a kind of a statement of purpose that I put out there at that time, and I mentioned that the Breaking Time was in favor of pragmatists and organizers and a whole different slew of traits. So if there's one thing that I want people to do, it's engage with the world. And There Is No They, I think, is a statement of reality rather than like a never pass judgment. It's just trying to not make those judgments blanket. And there's actually an example that I have that I like to use about using There Is No They properly. And the civil rights movement, of course, faced hideous violence and clamp downs from state and local governments, from secret societies, from vigilantes, all sorts of other stuff. A lot of bigotry reaching back centuries in some cases. But if you look at the images that people like Martin Luther King Jr. and all were painting of their enemies, and they were very much engaged in a life or death fight there, they didn't hesitate to pass judgment on bigotry, as people shouldn't. But at the same time, they focused on highlighting the absolute worst actions of segregationists, church bombings, lynchings, things like that. And these were important to highlight because they were very real. They were going on. But when they highlighted those things, you have people who maybe they believed in segregation because that's how they were raised or something like that, who were appalled by this when they saw this. And so all of a sudden, instead of just blanketly saying, everyone who's, at that point may have been against civil rights, we're going to go after all of them. They showed how bad that system was. They went after the worst parts of it, and they used that to divide it. They divided a lot of its casual supporters off. And over time, that's made, rightly, prejudices that were once widely held are now, viewed negatively throughout much more of society than they used to be. And so they refused to see they paired these condemnations of these horrible atrocities with rhetoric of peace and welcoming, that everyone could live together. And so that was kind of a way of, they didn't see an easy they there. The civil rights campaigners didn't, but they still managed to make judgments, go forward, engage, and win against the odds, quite frankly.
Right, because then the less extreme people said, oh, wait, I'm not that.
Exactly.
I'm not that thing. I don't want to align with that kind of energy, that kind of actions.
Exactly. And because of that, they, took something that they could have seen as a monolith and looked at the divisions and broke off the parts of that could be taken away. And in addition to, the moral nature of needing to kind of stop segregation and stop oppression, it was also tactically brilliant. And I think we forget sometimes in kind of making some of those figures like Gandhi or Tutu or Martin Luther King Jr. into kind of secular saints, that these people were brilliant tacticians. They were figuring out ways to achieve practical victories and go from there. That's one thing I mean when I say the Breaking Time is in favor of pragmatism and organization. I hope people will look at problems and then go out there and try to fix them, however imperfectly.
Right. Do you feel like today's activists are anywhere near that level of scope?
That depends on who you're talking about.
Right.
I have seen some positive signs. I think more people are starting to practically kind of engage.
I guess my question was, do you have specific examples of I just was engaging and they talking, I think, but generalizations. But yeah, specific examples. Like, have you seen any groups that you feel like they're really good in the tactician department?
Well, I think the LGBT movement has certainly been gaining successes, but I'll note that's been an exception. I think for whatever kind of cultural energies that the 60s unleashed, I think a lot of the baby boomer activism was quite frankly devastating in terms of getting practical things accomplished. It tended to go so decentralized that it became not just hard to have things be too hierarchical, but hard to rally any forces whatsoever. There shifted a lot more emphasis on a lot less emphasis on specific goals, a lot more emphasis on kind of cultural posturing. What products did someone buy? How many marches did they go to, regardless of whether those marches got kind of things accomplished. And you look to some of the LGBT movement, which I think has been more successful, and the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, and they did a good job of using, say, street protests not as a ends in itself, but as a tactic to specifically achieve other things, usually a smaller goal, such as voting or the bus boycott, that would then, or a change in gender discrimination laws, that would then take them a step further towards a larger goal of seeing kind of their vision of the world accomplished. I think I've been covering a lot of activism in recent years. I think in some of the spurt of activism that I've been seeing recently, a lot of local activists, just local-ist activists, period, and in some of the activists that kind of came out, I guess, in connection to some of the Occupy movement, though some of them haven't remained affiliated with that. I think you're seeing people who are starting to try to engage with some of the practical parts again, and it's going to be a long challenge, and some of them will be successful, some of them won't, and some of them I agree with their causes and some I don't. But I think the idea that the world is something to go out there and engage with, and that you have to, I wouldn't say accept imperfections, but you have to find a way to deal with them. You have to accept that this is not going to be a perfect endeavor. I think you're starting to see a little more of that, but a lot of that might just be my kind of sense on the ground.
Well, and Asheville is its own little place, like you're kind of
certainly.
It's not the only place in the United States that's like it, but it's one of a handful of like middle-sized cities that have a decent amount of like the hippie liberal types, but then also quite a few, more redneck right-wing types. And then mixed with that, you got the all the mountain people who are sometimes just unaffiliated with anything. So you have a really interesting mix of people in Asheville that's pretty unique. And you have the whole tourist thing, but at the same time, a lot of poverty.
Yes, and actually, that's a huge thing I focus on, the Mountain Express. Asheville is, in some ways, I've said it's the city of the future in both good and bad ways. It has a re-energized downtown, a very entrepreneurial spirit. We have a beer industry here that kind of, an arts industry that pretty much arose from just people going out, doing this in their basements or, old warehouse spaces and things like that. So you've got that amazing energy, but at the same time, the wages on average are $97 less than the state average per week. You have, lots of low-wage stuff. The housing is not remotely affordable. So you have, I think, kind of a microcosm of a lot of the issues that the country as a whole, and I should say not just our country. These issues are present other places, but they're particularly acute here. And I think it's interesting to see how Asheville's own struggles will play out, because I think if some of those things are solved, they could be solutions that are also applicable elsewhere.
Right. Well, there's a lot of localization work that's happening. A lot of like community gardens and all sorts of food sovereignty work that's happening. There's the transition towns and everything like that. And that could just be because that was the people that I hung out with when I lived there. But it seems like there's a lot there. But it's still like less than 5% of the food eaten in Asheville is local, I think.
I haven't heard any firm statistics on that lately,
okay.
But it's less than one might think. At the same time, all the places I've lived in, this is the easiest to get relatively affordable. Though I wish there were better ways of advertising that, because it takes a while to find out about it. Of getting relatively affordable food that's, if not local, fairly close to. And so there are some resources kind of growing in those directions too, and it'll be interesting. It's interesting because one of the things about breaking times, I guess, kind of these crux moments where everything kind of seems up for grabs, are that people start trying a lot of different solutions, and some of them are wonderful, some of them are so-so but might develop in a good direction, and some of them are horrible. I think that and Asheville, like any other place, you see all of the above.
Right. Well, back to the Occupy movement just a bit, because you were talking about activists in Asheville, and some of them had started with the Occupy movement. As you know, like Occupy nationally had a lot of criticism for not being more centralized, not having more concrete work. But at the same time, in my opinion, it was really valuable because it seemed to shift the country's dialogue quite a bit. So that by itself, to me, is an accomplishment. Do you see that shift having taken place, or?
Go on. My apologies.
Or no, that was me trailing off. That was the end of the question.
There is some merit to that, and certainly while I have a role both as a kind of offering larger commentary at the breaking time, but I also covered extensively the Occupy movement here in Asheville, including some of the inner struggles that it had and some of the clashes between different generations and different perspectives and things like that. I think that the claim Occupy can make that it did shift the discourse is a legitimate one, whether people like that particular shift or not. I think is a very legitimate claim. The things like the 99%, that sort of stuff, that just the use of Occupy as a capital O word, especially is interesting to see that crop up more and more as a journalist. Those are certainly shifts, but it's kind of and I've made my personal feelings on consensus structures plain before Occupy started. I think that they are not specifically the best way to handle political struggle. They have major drawbacks, and most of the movements that have used them on a large scale have not been successful. And I think you did see some of that in Occupy. There was a lot of infighting, well reported by sources that didn't particularly have any agenda, by media outlets that I think did a very good and fair job of researching a lot of these issues. And it did shift the discourse, but historically that's what leftist protest and Occupy certainly fits in that tradition, has been good at. It's been good at marshaling energy. It's been good at getting memes around. It's been good at spreading energy. Now, just from a viewpoint of people who want to be successful and involved in it, the question is, can it maintain those? Can it take a shift in discourse, which is kind of this amorphous thing, and pin it down to people committing to specific changes in the way things work governmentally or politically or otherwise? And that's very much an open question, because over the last 30 or 40 years, with some exceptions, leftist protest has generally been terrible at that sort of consolidation.
Is there anything that you feel will really make a difference? It doesn't have to be mass movements, but where do you feel some of the changes can come from? Is it specific leaders, or what would you say it is?
Oh, that's a very large question. But kind of one of the things I go from, at least at the breaking time, is almost everywhere. Like, there is not a sphere of life that doesn't need people going and engaging with it. But the key word is engage. And I think we talked about power and power dynamics a little bit earlier. But I think one thing that people kind of have to get back in their minds is that people, including people who have been trying to improve the world, have thought of power as this kind of separate thing. It's somewhere else in the state house or Washington D.C. or it's something separate that we have to speak truth to or we have to be afraid of. In reality, power is people's ability, for better or worse, to affect their surroundings. And I think whatever sphere it's in, whether it's the media or politics or mass activism or local activism or whatever, people need to start figuring out ways to engage with that again. And in engaging with it, accept it. Accept that you're going to have some people in leadership positions. Accept that there is going to be a distribution of power, because then you can talk about what it looks like and what way that you do it is as healthy as possible. Imperfect, because humans are always imperfect, but maybe ways that are better than ways we have set up now.
Among people that I know, there's a lot of cynicism. Isn't even a strong enough word for how, honestly, myself and a lot of people I know feel about politics.
Yes.
Because it doesn't seem like the two-party system is even valid anymore. It's just kind of one big corporate party that kind of leans one way or the other.
Personally, I don't think that diagnosis is accurate, that there is a disturbing amount of overlap between different political factions. But this is not new. Go back through the history of the late 1800s or even the history of the 1950s, and you'll see kind of figures that overlap, positions that overlap, that both parties, in whatever form they took, and they've changed somewhat drastically in those times, in what they kind of pursued. But at the same time, and this is, you can look at this across the industrialized world, even in countries that have multi-party systems, they tend to shift into two basic coalitions in most places, and you'll occasionally have like a smaller party jump ship from a coalition or something like that. So I think it's easy to look at some of the issues we have now, some of which are issues with this specific system, and some of which are broader human issues. People fighting over power is never pretty. It's always got an element of ugliness to it, even if it's being done through the ballot box or mass movements, even if it's being done relatively peacefully. It's simply not a very lovely process. And that old analogy about looking at sausage being made is a pretty accurate one. And some of that is because I think there is a lot of parts of our political system that don't necessarily work as well as they used to. It's kind of showing its age in some ways. But at the same time, I think I kind of have to encourage people not to give up, despite the fact that there is corruption, despite the fact that there is, kind of institutional gridlock in a lot of areas. Because the fact is, a lot of the movements we've been talking about faced way worse, and a lot of people in other parts of the world are facing phenomenally worse odds, and still going through, still trying to, craft together some better solution. So, this isn't easy. It never is. And I kind of want more people to accept that you still fight anyway. You don't withdraw. You don't, kind of turn your back on it. You figure out what the best pressure point is from, whatever someone's personal perspective or personal talents are, and you start pressing on it. And that accepts that it's going to be a long fight, that it's going to have, setbacks and compromises and mess-ups to it. But the alternative is things just frankly getting worse. So that's my personal perspective on it.
Well, thanks for sharing that perspective.
My pleasure.
I mean, like I said, the issue I feel like both parties are kind of the same on is corporate power. I mean, Democrats might say more against it, but I feel like the way the policies have been going is pretty pro-corporate. But I see what you're saying. I mean, you got to engage.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there are certainly similarities, as there are. I mean, when people talk about the parties, they're talking about this huge grouping of factions. We've got a political system where that puts industrial belt, blue collar union guys in the same party with California tech entrepreneurs, and on the other end, big business guys in a party with religious fundamentalists. But nonetheless, there is some overlap, as there is in a lot of political systems. And some of that overlap is either disturbing or frankly corrupt. But at the same time, the two parties have different bases. They have different groups that they respond to. And you've seen that recently, for example, with a lot of the on the Democrat side, a lot of their changes in positions on LGBT issues, which has been a fairly recent change. That's happening because they're responding to one pressure group, because that part of their political base is there. On the other side, you've seen a lot of Republican legislators who might not personally share the goals of the Tea Party have to start embracing that, because they have a lot of political clout right now. So they're still, I understand where that impression comes from, but I personally think that they're still somewhat different entities, and that's worth assessing when people are looking for pressure points or how they want to participate in the political system.
Okay. I'm going to change the subject just slightly.
Go for it.
One of the major subjects of the breaking time is culture. Mm-hmm. How do you feel culture fits into all this? Do you feel like culture is reactive, or do you feel like it's generative of changes? Like, where does that question make sense, or should I rephrase it?
Oh, no, that question makes perfect sense. I feel it's more culture is, of course, more reactive, but I feel culture is more generative than reactive. And actually, one reason I started the breaking time is because when I was looking at reporting about the future, or futurism, it often focused on tech and economics as drivers in their own right, But the fact is, humans just don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to make a widget, or I'm going to make this. People make things because they feel they fulfill a cultural niche. And that goes for everything from, the internet, which was developed for very specific reasons, to all the, terrible weapon systems that were made in the 50s because the culture thought we need to make terrible weapon systems. I wrote recently something about the way that the online communication and interaction is changing basic social circles among a lot of people. And one of the points in there was that the internet, I think, if not necessarily its direct invention, its popularization, especially the popularization of social media, in a lot of ways can be viewed as culture using tech to make a giant antidote to alienation. There was this sense of alienation that people have been writing about since like the 1830s, with all the upheaval that kind of the modern era has caused. And so people, humans being clever creatures that we are, start to look for solutions to that. We start to look for tools. And so I think in that way culture is kind of generative. A favorite example that I have is that the Greeks were dealing with, primitive steam engines. But you didn't have the steam age in ancient Greece because they just didn't see a use for them. The culture wasn't there to see that there was this thing you could make use of. And by the same token, what we expect in our economic system or in our political system is very largely shaped by what our culture is and how that culture is changing and what people think that culture should and shouldn't be.
And how does culture change?
People wake up and think differently. I mean, that's a gross oversimplification, of course. But,
and it's a broad question, and I know that.
Yeah, indeed it is. But, if someone, say, doesn't feel satisfied with the way they're living, for whatever reason, and so they go out and try to change that, and if they hit enough of a chord, a bunch of other people feel similar concerns, they'll start doing it too. Or they'll all start responding to the same pressures. There was this, with kind of everything from the invention of the internal combustion engine to kind of the upheaval as far as people moving around from city to city, people started to feel kind of a loss of community. So now you have a lot of people in different ways attaching to various localist movements, or trying to, create more sustainable stuff in their area, or focusing on, how to revive their downtown or their city core. So it's, people see a need in a culture. They don't feel right for some reason, right or wrong. I mean, you could say the fundamentalist backlash was due to their feeling their culture was under threat. And they start trying to, quote unquote, fix this in a lot of different ways. And some of that stuff's going to stick. Some of that stuff is going to get enough followers and enough people agreeing with it or repeating it that it will become part of the culture.
That makes sense.
Oh, thank you. I hope so.
Well, that ties in.
I'm trying to figure most of this out myself.
Well, I mean, we all are, really. I mean, and that seems like one of the directions you're trying to go with your blog is create a space for people to think about it together.
I am, very much, and this is probably a good point for me to put in the plug that we are definitely looking for guest contributors. So if anyone out there is, from pieces long or short and from whatever perspective, if they're interested in participating as a contributor in The Breaking Time, they can shoot me an email at thebreakingtime@gmail.com, and we'll go from there.
And you're interested in people, all kinds of viewpoints.
Exactly. I've got a blog post that goes into a little more depth on it, but specifically, I come from obviously kind of a journalism and a history and a politics viewpoint. We had an excellent piece recently by Damian Williams, who wrote kind of a more media, like pop culture media, combined with the I Ching, combined with some kind of looking into some themes in mysticism sort of perspective. And that's an example of how kind of wide we can run the game. If someone has something to say about the era in which we live, I'll at least hear them out on putting a piece up on The Breaking Time.
Very cool. One thing that I liked what you said about the way change happens is that people see a need. And part of the reason that kind of clicked for me, and I just had to reflect on it for a second, was because I'm always interested in storytelling and story and how it shapes people's personal lives. And that's the basic place that you start any kind of story or like film or short story or things like that, is you have a character and they need something.
Yep.
And then the entire story is them trying to get that.
And I think, go on, sorry.
And failing or succeeding along the way. And it's really the journey that's the interesting part. But it's that need that it starts with.
Indeed it is. And it's, in the end, in the end, this is humans trying to figure things out. It's as simple and at some points as profound or devastating as that is. And it's interesting because, the blog goes into a fair amount about dark ages and collapses and upheavals and kind of the negative side of things. But also I try to at least go into some of the positive potential of a lot of the changes that are going on, because this sort of upheaval a lot of the time is a lot of people trying to fix stuff. A lot of people feel that the current status quo, literally in the old Latin sense of where things stand, just doesn't work out for them from a lot of different perspectives. And so you see them kind of, throwing spaghetti at the wall or throwing darts to the dartboard and hoping something hits and something sticks. And so you get this outpouring, and this happens plenty of times throughout history, this outpouring of different movements and perspectives, some of which will last, some of which won't, some of which may have good consequences or bad, kind of trying to fix it. And the Renaissance in the 1500s very much kind of came from that sort of outpouring and attempted solution finding, because humans don't sit still. It's one of the things that occasionally saves our species, is that we'll start trying to find a bunch of solutions for something. At the same time, the Renaissance was also the high point of the Inquisition, because some people think the solution is a backlash or a reinforcement of, or a return to an old version of the status quo. So you've got all these forces kind of colliding at the same time, and honestly, how it plays out is anyone's guess.
I really enjoyed the piece you had in the blog about China's history, a breaking time that they went through. Do you want to tell me, just want to tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Oh, certainly. I've always found Chinese history fairly fascinating, specifically because it was a society that hit a very high level of technological advancement fairly early. It's been through a lot of these same upheavals, and the image that a lot of people have of it is, speaking of there is no they, is pretty stereotypical. There's this image of, China being this kind of xenophobic, closed-off society or whatever. And while there's certainly periods, just like there are periods in many Western societies where that's happened, you've also had these periods of, of cultural hybrids, of, amazing kind of dealing with upheaval. But, yeah, the piece we wrote a little while back, or I wrote a little while back, was on Liu Bang, who was the first emperor of the Han Dynasty. Fascinating figure, who started off essentially as a drunken peasant beat cop and ended up as the emperor of China. And the story itself, it has a lot to say about, how upheaval is dealt with, what things do and don't work. China had an amazingly repressive regime that kind of knit the country together, but then collapsed as soon as the, very authoritarian emperor died. And so it's just, there's this whole fascinating history of humans, in many ways, just like in anywhere else in the world, trying to find a bunch of answers. That's a similar period is where Taoism and Confucianism and a lot of the other kind of isms from Eastern philosophy originated, because people were trying to find answers to the problems that they faced. And I think a lot of the time those answers are either stereotyped. Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism certainly have as problematic a history as any other ideology, but also some interesting insights as well. And I think it's worth taking a look at those and not just focusing ad nauseum on, say, the collapse of Rome, important topic as that can be, but also looking at what other societies around the world have faced and what answers they found and what that might kind of indicate for our era.
Well, and how they came up with the answers that did end up working for them. Exactly.
That's an excellent example, because China went through a doozy of a societal breakdown several times over, and the answers they found, I think, are pretty revealing in a lot of ways.
Right. And you do encourage people on your blog quite a bit to be looking at history more. And as you're talking, it's just interesting to think about how a lot of times we have really linear ideas of history, like this happened and then this happened and this happened. And sort of when you rush through it, like I don't know, I feel like we often are as we're learning it. I didn't learn history in a really in-depth, let's look at everything that was going on in that moment. So it's easy to look at times like that and think of things as being an inevitable, that the changes that happen next were inevitable. But when you do dig in and look at all the different directions it could have gone and all the chaos, then it sort of makes right now maybe seem less scary.
Indeed it does. And that's, in the end, what we're facing is the structures that other humans set up, and other humans can change them. Nothing is inevitable. And that's, I think, one of the great lessons about history. And it's easy to see it that way when you're in it. And certainly there are large trends that are either hard to stop or have to be dealt with in some way. Huge trends of economics or natural environment or whatever that certainly affect things. But humans have shown a remarkable ability to adapt and change those. Not always for the better, I should add. And one of the reasons that the Breaking Time and myself encourage engagement is because this stuff isn't set in stone. It's not linear. It's a bunch of the way I started learning history after I lucked up on some really good mentors was as a series of stories, and that's not how it makes the most sense for everyone, but it makes sense for me that way. And I think it's useful to see those as kind of an interconnecting series of stories. Both stories that cultures tell themselves about themselves, but also a series of stories about how humans being humans, play out over and over and over again. But yeah, there is absolutely nothing inevitable about where we are today. There is nothing inevitable about any particular direction we're heading, whether it's a utopia or a dystopia, and I really hope no one ever forgets that.
I love that. I'd like to finish out talking just kind of about the patterns and themes that are going on right now. One of the posts that you have on your blog is about recent shootings and how the media sort of goes into all of these hysterical reactions, all sorts of different ways. And you talked about Columbine and how all the hysteria around Columbine, I'm actually going to quote from you. You said, what resulted from all that righteous fury? Mostly stupid zero-tolerance policies that screwed up a bunch of awkward kids' lives because an administrator pounced on a joke or some angsty poetry. The hysteria didn't save anyone. Deep down, I don't think it was meant to. All the cries for action, then and now, are reassurance more than anything else. The talking heads are there to tell us that we can control the situation, to keep us away from a more disturbing conclusion. Absolute safety is a lie. Our lives, happy or otherwise, can be ended or shattered for no good reason by people who aren't operating by any sort of rules. That really struck me because I wonder, and I'm not nearly as buff on history as you are. I know some, but I certainly not. I don't have an extensive knowledge of history. But is that something that we're unique in at this time, that we feel like it's possible to think that our lives really are that secure? Because we do have a lot of securities. Are we unique in the idea that we think that absolute safety is a possibility?
I don't think we're unique in it. I think it is one of those, like people trying to find solutions to problems. I think it is a very understandably human urge. But, a lot of understandably human urges can cause a lot of tragedy. And it's interesting, I wrote that piece after the Fort Hood shootings, and it's sadly become a little relevant again. I really wish it weren't, because I'd never want to see tragedies like that happen. But I see the same kind of thing playing out today. There are legitimate debates to be had over, say, how society does or doesn't handle weapons and how much access its citizens do or don't have to that. There's legitimate debates about negative parts of culture or post-traumatic stress and disorder or any number of other things. But when people attach it to an individual incident, when they expect that there is some way to be completely and totally safe, it ends up going to a very dark place most of the time, because while we're not unique in it, I think the level of media saturation we have, and the way in which that encourages people to just react and look for something immediately to be done. I think it's a nice dovetailing of kind of the downside of mass media, but also the human instinct to find a problem. It's a bad way of it working out. There is no way you can make a society so secure that some maniac cannot go out and kill people. None. And that doesn't mean that, there aren't legitimate debates to be had over safety, or over any number of other issues, but you will never be able to reach that point. And I grew up during the Columbine era. I went through high school while it was going on, and I saw those policies go into effect based on a narrative that it was later found out was mostly false about the type of person that those idiots were. But I think it's something that's best steered away from. But it's hard to. Not many people in this era want to calm people down, and I think that's actually a really big problem. And everything has to be reacted to immediately, and people want these really quick solutions, and that makes things, I think, like terrorism more effective. I think it makes the impact of shootings, which have happened for quite a long time, I should add. I mean, we forget the bell tower shootings in the 60s in Texas, or the postal service tragedies that happened during the 80s. But people snapping and doing terrible violence is not anything new. But it's easy. People don't have that much memory, so it's easy to think that it is. And when they think that it is, it's easy to think that this is something kind of going to destroy their lives. And so they want people who they view as having a position of power, whether it's politicians or community leaders or whatever, to assure them this will never happen again. And who's the politician going to go out there and say, I'm sorry, there's no way we can ever make you completely safe from this sort of thing happening?
It just seems silly to me that people think that it's a possibility that they can be guaranteed safety. I mean, we're all mortal. Things happen. It's always been that way. We're always, vulnerable.
Well, you're completely right, but people don't want to viscerally accept that. And it's just tricky. It's one of those visceral human urges. People want to be safe. They want to be told that the good times are going to last forever. They don't want to be told that they'll have to make any hard sacrifices, and they don't want to be told that there is a random element to the world that no matter how good they are, how well they prepare, can hurt them.
Interesting. So what patterns do you see right now? Is there anything that is unique to this time?
Oh, there are plenty of things I think that are unique to this time. I think the way that I wrote a little longer about this recently. I think the way that social circles are changing. I noticed this a while back that for my parents' generation, at least it seemed like many of them, they would shed parts of their social circle, maybe keep a friend or two that they would talk with on the phone occasionally if they moved from a place or on from a point in life. But thanks to the way media works now, that's not happening as much anymore. People can keep the ice broken with people who live on the other side of the world. And
right, because you talked about that New Orleans conference that you went to, and then you were running into all kinds of people that you probably wouldn't even know that you were running into if it weren't for social media. Exactly,
and also old friends that I'd kept up with through that had ended up in New Orleans, and I emphasize that was a city that I never even took affiliation with, never been there, never lived there, and that's happening more and more, and I think that's going to make a lot of different social arrangements, that level of connection, I think, and how much more widespread it is. It's not the province of the well-heeled jet set anymore to have this kind of larger social network spread around the country or even around the world. I think that's going to make some new social forms possible, and I think it'll be interesting to see what those are. One thing that's been on my mind lately also is how the ethos of my generation, and I'll turn 30 next month, how that's kind of evolving, and the millennials, as I guess they're kind of called.
Right.
And one of the things and this is actually a hopeful trend, is that there seems to be despite all the scolding they get from other generations and from pundits and people like that, despite all the crud that has been kind of left around for them to deal with, there's this kind of sense of, I guess, battered optimism or determination. I think that it's not a sense of, I think like the baby boomers had, that great things are possible because, we're coming out of World War II and all this technology is around and there's all this prosperity. I think it's a sense of we're going to make the world a better place, odds be damned. I think it's born kind of growing up in uncertain times and facing uncertain things and still wanting to make something better out of your life. I also think there is more of a trend to dense urbanization with the rise in gas prices. I think we mentioned to see how that shakes out. And these are just a few of the big ones. So there's lots and lots and lots. It's the thing about history. While some of the patterns reoccur, some of them do. Finding out which patterns reoccurring at which time and what the details of it are extremely important. And sometimes something new just comes out of left field, and I have no doubt that this era will be no exception to that.
Right. Well, and right now we have things like climate change, too, that seem like they could be game changers or game enders.
Yes. I grew up in the northeastern part of North Carolina, which is completely flat coastline. I worry about what the effects of climate change could be and, who it could hurt. And that's one of those elephants in the room. It's something that sooner or later is going to be dealt with. And dealt with and solved are two different things. But it is the consequences of that sooner or later are going to happen, period. And it's a matter of how they're dealt with or not dealt with and who gets hit the worst by it. Or if it's, largely averted. And there's something by a quote by Jacques Barzun, who's a historian, still living amazingly. He's past a century at this old at this point. And he wrote this fantastic book called From Dawn to Decadence that I encourage anyone out there to read. And he noted that if it seems like the odds in this era are greater because it is global, because we're dealing with huge issues like climate change or, resource issues, upheaval, we should remember that our powers are greater too. We do have an ability to learn. We have a level of literacy that the human race has never seen before. We have tools at our disposal, whether they're technological or the ability for greater cultural connection, that we have never ever seen. And I think that gets missed sometimes. Is that humans have fought through a lot of crud, and I think we continue to do so.
I like that. I like we have the more abilities. And you were talking about that a little bit before, but I wanted to touch on that some more. With the internet, you were talking about social media and how that changes our relatedness to each other, but I'm really interested in how that impacts information, the sharing of information, which is definitely nothing like we've seen before, the ability for information to really get out there. And you talked on your blog, this one was a while ago, about Suitcase. I forget what it was called. I forgot the name of the post. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but I know it's about a project partly funded by the U.S. government, ironically, that was essentially internet in a suitcase for an area like, say, Tahrir or Cairo, or Tahrir is in Cairo, or any of these places where the internet has kind of played a role in an uprising against a despotic regime. And I think that technology is interesting because the kind of technologies that I think are most interesting from kind of the breaking time perspective are the ones that are cheap, durable, and pack a punch. And something like there's a way to keep, to provide a temporary internet access when it's been shut down and someone's fighting a despotism, and that you can fit this in a suitcase. That's a pretty interesting project. Yeah.
I just think it's important to keep kind of the focus on real game changers like that, and not, whatever Apple put out this week, which may be interesting, but is less likely to really be like, well, that certainly changed things.
Well, I always worry about internet things. It seems like there's always the danger that our internet, could be either not, I don't know about shut down, but censored more and more, things like that. And that seems like this could be gotten around. Like reading that post gave me a lot of hope that, even if it happens here or wherever, it can be gotten around.
Well, yes, and I think that's that's kind of I guess I talked about the battered determination earlier. Every time humans erect a barrier, other humans try to start figuring a way around it. And I think technology is no exception. I mean, so far, every repressive apparatus that humanity has ever come up with has cracked and broken eventually. And the more repressive, the worse it's cracked up and broken. Every time, the harder and harder a tyrant or somebody tries to kind of close the fist, as it were, the just greater it breaks down. And that's humans. Rebellion is as old as the opposable thumb. Humans are going to start figuring ways around stuff, whether it's the internet or slipping secret messages to each other by hand or what have you. And it amazes me. I think we can just see this a little easier because with the internet, it records more of these cultural trends. It's amazing to me the speed at which it can be done these days. The speed at which someone can start figuring out their way around the barrier. And I don't know. I mean, I think some of this may have negative trends too. I mean, at some point in the future, we are going to see the first. And there's some cases where the internet's already played a role in things like rioting, but we're going to see the first internet-run lynch mob at some place, and in some horrible day, because these tools never go just one direction. People pick them up and use them, and some people pick them up and use them for horrible purposes. So it's worth keeping in mind.
Okay. So we can wrap up now, or if there's anything else you'd like to talk about, we can talk about it. Do you have anything on your mind?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I want to thank you for kind of reaching out to us and doing this interview. I'm interested to see other people's insights on it. I mean, I've got my own perspectives, but those are limited, and no doubt I'm missing plenty. So I invite people to go to Breaking Time to weigh in, and what do you think?
Awesome. And the website
is thebreakingtime.typepad.com.
And I've also noticed that if you type The Breaking Time into Google, it's usually the first or second
Excellent. Yeah.
search entry. So you can search on it in Google and you'll get there.
Sweet. Yeah, and you will indeed. And thebreakingtime.com itself redirects there as well. So
awesome. And there's a place on there for people to reach you.
There is indeed. My email is right on there. They're also free to comment on anything that strikes their fancy.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I very much appreciate it. It's been really fun talking to you.
It's been an interesting conversation. I thank you for the great questions.
Yay. All right. Everybody have a great night.